The train's whistle pierced the desert air as it pulled into Copper Ridge Station, a sound that would haunt Rebecca Matthews for the rest of her days. She clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, feeling the weight of her entire life compressed into that single bag. The photograph in her coat pocket, the only image she had of Thomas Garrett, her intended husband, had grown soft from her nervous handling during the 3-day journey from Chicago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca stepped onto the wooden platform, her city boots clicking against the weathered planks. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly before her, all rust-colored rock and unforgiving sky. She had expected someone to meet her, perhaps Thomas himself, but the platform was eerily quiet, except for the retreating chuff of the locomotive. A weathered man in a sheriff's badge approached her slowly, his hat pulled low against the afternoon. "Son, you wouldn't happen to be Miss Matthews, would you?" His voice carried the weight of bad news. "I am. I'm here to meet Thomas Garrett." Rebecca's voice wavered slightly. Something in the sheriff's expression made her stomach tighten. Sheriff Dutch Coleman removed his hat, revealing gray hair that spoke of too many difficult conversations. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some terrible news. Thomas Garrett passed away 4 days ago." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had traveled over 1,000 miles, leaving behind her job at the textile mill and her cramped boarding house room in Chicago, all based on 3 months of correspondence with a man she'd never met. Now he is dead. "How?" she whispered. "Mining. Accident up at his claim. Cave-in." Coleman's eyes were kind but tired. "I'm really sorry, miss. Thomas mentioned you might be coming, but we had no way to reach you once you'd left Chicago." Rebecca stood frozen on that platform, surrounded by her impossible situation. She had exactly $12 to her name and no means of returning home. The boarding house where she'd lived had already rented her room to someone else. Her job at the mill had been filled the day she left. What am I supposed to do now? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Thomas did leave some things behind. His cabin, for one. Nothing too fancy, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. You're welcome to stay there while you figure things out. It's the least we can do." That first night in Thomas Garrett's cabin was the loneliest of Rebecca's life. The single room was sparse but clean, with a bed, a small table, and a stone fireplace. Personal effects were scattered throughout, a coffee cup still sitting on the table, a book left open to page 43, work clothes hanging on a peg. By the door, it felt like interrupting someone's life mid-sentence. She found his letters to her tucked in a wooden box beside the bed. Reading them again, she noticed details that hadn't stood out before. Thomas had been secretive about his work, mentioning only that he worked the land and had prospects that might pay off someday. He'd never specifically mentioned mining, though that wasn't unusual for the territory. The next morning, Rebecca walked into town to understand her situation better. Copper Ridge was barely a town at all. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and perhaps 20 other buildings scattered along a dusty main street. The people were polite but distant, offering condolences but little else. At Henderson's general store, she met Martha Henderson, a woman in her 50s, who seemed to be the unofficial keeper of local information. Thomas was a good man, Martha told her while weighing out flour. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, been working on that claim of his for about 2 years. Was it profitable? Rebecca asked. Martha's expression grew cautious. Hard to say. Mining's unpredictable out here. Some folks strike it rich, others spend their lives moving rocks for nothing. That afternoon, Rebecca decided to visit Thomas's mining claim. She needed to understand what she'd inherited, if anything. The walk took her 3 miles into the foothills, following a trail that became increasingly rough and narrow. The mine entrance was little more than a hole carved into the hillside, supported by wooden beams. Mining equipment lay scattered around: pickaxes, shovels, a wheelbarrow, and what looked like a sluice box for washing ore. The recent cave-in was obvious. Loose rock and debris blocked the main tunnel about 20 feet in. As she examined the site, Rebecca found something that made her pause. Hidden beneath a tarp behind some large boulders was equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than what lay scattered in plain view. There were precision scales, small vials of chemicals she couldn't identify, and detailed geological maps of the area marked with symbols and notations in Thomas's handwriting. One map caught her attention particularly. It showed not just Thomas's claim, but several surrounding areas marked with different colored ink. Red X's marked specific locations, with notes scrawled beside them in Thomas's neat script. High-grade visible, promising vein structure, assay results pending. This wasn't the equipment of a casual prospector hoping to get lucky. This was the toolkit of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. That evening, Rebecca spread the maps across Thomas's table and tried to make sense of them. The geological surveys were detailed and professional, nothing like the rough sketches she'd expected from a simple miner. There were references to ore compositions, mineral densities, and extraction techniques that suggested Thomas had formal training. In geology or mining engineering, she found more surprises in the cabin that night. Behind a loose floorboard, she discovered a leather portfolio containing correspondence with assay offices in Phoenix and Tucson. The letters were technical, discussing ore samples and mineral content analysis. One letter from Phoenix Geological, services dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, contained results that made her heart race. Sample 547 shows exceptional gold content, 18.2 ounces per ton. Recommend immediate expanded extraction procedures, 18 ounces per ton. Even Rebecca, with no mining experience, understood that was extraordinary. Most profitable gold mines produce 2 to 3 ounces per ton. The final document in the portfolio was a hand-drawn map of the mine tunnels, far more extensive than what she'd seen from the outside. According to Thomas's notes, the main tunnel continued much deeper than the cave-in point, branching into multiple shafts. One section was marked Main Vein, Do Not Discuss. As she studied the documents by lamplight, a chill ran down Rebecca's spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air. If Thomas had discovered gold in the quantities these documents suggested, his death seemed far less like an accident and far more like something much darker. She thought about Sheriff Coleman's words, mining accident up at his claim, cave-in. But looking at these maps and surveys, Thomas appeared to be an experienced, careful miner who understood geological structures intimately. How likely was it that someone with his knowledge would make the kind of mistake that led to a fatal cave-in? The more she learned about Thomas Garrett, the more questions arose. Who was this man she'd agreed to marry? Why had someone with apparent geological expertise been living alone in a cabin in the Arizona territory, working a claim that might be worth a fortune? And most troubling of all, if Thomas had discovered something valuable enough to kill for, what did that mean for her safety now that she was living in his cabin and asking questions about his work? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending something skittering across the roof. Rebecca blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the desert night and wondering if she was truly alone in the canyon, or if someone else knew about Thomas's discovery and was watching to see what she would do next. The next morning brought visitors that would change everything. Rebecca was preparing coffee when she heard horses approaching the cabin. Through the window, she watched 3 men dismount, 2 she didn't recognize, and Sheriff Coleman trailing behind them with obvious reluctance. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that looked expensive, even covered in trail dust. His companion was smaller, wiry, with the kind of watchful eyes that missed nothing. Both men had the bearing of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Miss Matthews," the tall man removed his hat as he approached. "I'm Marcus Brenfield from the Territorial Mining Consortium. This is my associate, James Whitlock. We understand you've inherited Thomas Garrett's property." Rebecca opened the door cautiously. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brenfield?" "We're here to make you an offer. Thomas's mining claim has been inactive since his unfortunate accident, and we'd like to purchase it from you. The consortium is expanding operations in this region, and his claim would fit well with our plans." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably behind them. "Miss Matthews, these gentlemen insisted on coming out here this morning. I told them you might need more time to settle Thomas's affairs." "How much are you offering?" Rebecca asked, though something about Brenfield's eagerness made her suspicious. $500, cash, today." Brenfield's smile was practiced but didn't reach his eyes. "It's a generous offer for an inactive claim with structural problems." $500 was more money than Rebecca had ever seen at once, but Thomas's documents suggested his claim might be worth far more. "I'll need time to consider it." Whitlock spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Miss Matthews, you're new to the territory. Mining is dangerous work, especially for someone without experience. Accidents happen. It would be safer for everyone if you took Mr. Brenfield's offer and returned to wherever you came from." The implied warning hung in the air like smoke. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. "I think the lady's made it clear she needs time to think. Gentlemen, perhaps we should head back to town." After they left, Rebecca's hands shook as she poured her coffee. The visit confirmed her growing suspicions about Thomas's death. These men knew something about his claim, and they wanted her gone before she could discover what Thomas had found. That afternoon, she returned to the mine with a new purpose. If Thomas had hidden evidence of his discovery, she needed to find it before anyone else did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The blocked tunnel entrance looked impassable, but studying his maps more carefully, she noticed he'd marked a secondary entrance on the far side of the hill. The climb was treacherous, requiring her to navigate loose rock and thorny desert vegetation. Her city clothes were impractical for such work, but she pressed on, driven by necessity and growing determination. The secondary entrance was well concealed behind a natural rock formation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the tunnel was narrow but stable, supported by carefully placed timber beams. Thomas had been meticulous in his construction. A string ran along one wall, and following it led her deeper into the mountain than she'd expected. The air grew cooler as she descended, her lamplight casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. 20 minutes of careful walking brought her to a junction where the tunnel branched in 3 directions. Thomas's map indicated the main vein lay to the right, but scratched arrows on the wall pointed left toward what his notes had marked as storage, personal. The left tunnel opened into a natural cave that Thomas had converted into a workshop and storage area. What Rebecca found there took her breath away. Wooden crates lined the walls, each filled with ore samples that glittered with visible gold. A workbench held sophisticated testing equipment, scales and detailed notebooks, documenting his findings over the past 18 months. But it was the wall chart that made her understand the true scope of Thomas's discovery. He'd mapped an underground vein system that extended far beyond his own claim, running beneath several neighboring properties, including land owned by the Territorial Mining Consortium. His geological surveys indicated the main vein was not only incredibly rich, but larger than anything previously discovered in the territory. One notebook entry, dated a week before his death, revealed his dilemma. Brenfield suspects something. His questions about my equipment purchases are too specific. If the consortium learns about the true extent of the vein, they'll find ways to claim the entire area. Need to document everything before making any moves. The final entry was even more troubling. Someone's been watching the claim. Found boot prints near the main entrance that aren't mine. May need to move the samples to the backup location until I can figure out who to trust. Rebecca spent 2 hours examining Thomas's evidence. The ore samples represented wealth beyond imagination, but they also represented danger. If the consortium suspected what Thomas had found, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. As she prepared to leave, she heard something that froze her blood, voices echoing from the main tunnel system. Someone else was inside the mine. She extinguished her lamp immediately, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. The voices grew clearer as they approached. Brenfield and Whitlock, along with at least 2 other men. The cave-in was supposed to seal everything, Brenfield was saying. If that woman finds Garrett's samples, she'll realize what she's sitting on. Should have taken care of Garrett differently, Whitlock replied. Making it look like an accident was messy. Now we've got complications. The accident was necessary, a third voice said. Garrett was getting suspicious of our interest in his claim. He was asking too many questions in town about mineral rights and consortium ownership. It was only a matter of time before he put the pieces together. Rebecca pressed herself against the cave wall, hardly daring to breathe. They were admitting to murdering Thomas, and they were close enough that any sound would give away her location. We need to find his documentation, Brenfield continued. Garrett was too methodical to work without keeping records. If he mapped the full vein system, those documents are worth millions to us and dangerous as hell if they fall into the wrong hands. What about the woman? Whitlock asked. The offer was legitimate, $500 for what she thinks is a worthless claim. If she's smart, she'll take it and disappear. If she's not... His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The footsteps and voices began moving away, back toward the main entrance. Rebecca waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, before relighting her lamp and making her way back through the secondary tunnel. Her mind raced with the implications of what she'd overheard. Thomas Garrett hadn't been a simple prospector who got lucky. He'd been a trained geologist who'd discovered something that threatened the consortium's control over regional mining. They'd killed him to protect their interests, and now they wanted to buy his claim for a fraction of its value before anyone else realized what lay beneath the ground. But Thomas had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. He'd hidden his most valuable findings and documented everything. The question now was what Rebecca could do with that information without ending up like her intended husband. That evening, she sat in the cabin reviewing Thomas's papers with new understanding. His letters to her had been deliberately vague about his work because he'd been protecting both himself and her. If she'd arrived as planned and married him, she would have been in danger too. The correspondence revealed another layer to the conspiracy. Letters from Phoenix and Tucson indicated Thomas had been quietly building a case against the consortium's illegal land acquisition practices. Several mining claims in the region had been purchased under questionable circumstances, with original owners dying in accidents or disappearing entirely before their claims could be properly evaluated. Thomas had been gathering evidence not just about his own discovery, but about a pattern of fraud and murder spanning several years. The consortium wasn't just after his gold. They were eliminating anyone who might expose their systematic theft of valuable mining properties throughout the territory. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly hid the papers and approached cautiously. expecting to see Sheriff Coleman or perhaps Martha Henderson from the general store. Instead, a young Mexican man stood outside, hat in hand, looking nervously over his shoulder. "Señorita Matthews, my name is Diego Morales. I worked for Senor Garrett sometimes, helping with supplies and equipment. I heard about his death and wanted to express my condolences." Something in his manner suggested he had more to say than condolences. "Would you like to come in, Mr. Morales?" Inside, Diego accepted coffee but remained nervous, constantly glancing toward the windows. "Señorita, I must tell you something about Senor Garrett's death. The day he died, I was supposed to meet him at the mine to help move some equipment. When I arrived, I saw men leaving the area, men I recognized from the consortium. They didn't see me, but I saw them." Rebecca's heart pounded. "Did you tell the sheriff?" Diego shook his head. "The sheriff is a good man, but the consortium has influence with the territorial government. My word against theirs." He shrugged helplessly. "But Senor Garrett was kind to me, gave me work when others wouldn't. He deserves justice." "What else did you see that day?" "Before they left, one of the men, I think it was Whitlock, took something from near the mine entrance. A metal box, maybe the size of a book. Senor Garrett always carried it with him when he worked." Rebecca realized Diego was describing Thomas's sample case, probably containing his most recent ore specimens. The consortium hadn't just killed Thomas, they'd stolen evidence of his discovery. "There's something else," Diego continued. "Senor Garrett asked me to give you this if anything happened to him." He pulled a small, wrapped package from his jacket. He said, "If a woman named Rebecca ever came to Copper Ridge asking about him, I should find her and give her this." Inside the package was a key and a note in Thomas's handwriting. "Rebecca, if you're reading this, my fears about the consortium prove justified. This key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Phoenix. Box number 247. Everything you need to prove their crimes is there, along with assay reports that will show you what your inheritance is really worth. Trust no one in Copper Ridge except Diego Morales. Get to Phoenix safely and take everything to the U.S. Marshal's office. The evidence will speak for itself. I'm sorry our correspondence had to end this way. You deserved better. Thomas." The weight of responsibility settled on Rebecca's shoulders like a physical burden. Thomas had entrusted her not just with his fortune, but with exposing a conspiracy that had cost multiple lives. The consortium thought they were dealing with a frightened woman who would take their money and disappear. But they had underestimated both Thomas Garrett's preparation and Rebecca Matthews' determination. As Diego prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Señorita, you should know. Since your arrival, someone has been watching this cabin from the canyon rim. I've seen the reflection of his spyglass during the day. You are not safe here." After Diego left, Rebecca extinguished all lights and peered carefully through the cabin's windows. The canyon walls rose steeply on three sides, offering dozens of concealed positions for a watcher. Somewhere in those shadows, Thomas's killer was monitoring her every move, waiting to see what she would do next. The game had changed completely. She was no longer just a stranded mail-order bride, trying to survive in an unfamiliar place. She was the inheritor of a fortune and the keeper of evidence that could bring down a murderous conspiracy. The question was whether she could stay alive, long enough to use it. Dawn broke grey and threatening over Copper Ridge, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Rebecca had spent the night planning her escape to Phoenix, but as she prepared to leave, unexpected visitors arrived that would force her hand sooner than anticipated. Martha Henderson from the general store appeared at her door, breathless and agitated. Behind her stood a woman Rebecca hadn't met, tall, elegant, and clearly not from the territory, judging by her fine clothes and carefully styled hair. "Miss Matthews, this is Victoria Garrett," Martha said quickly. "Thomas's sister from San Francisco. She arrived on the morning train." Victoria Garrett stepped forward, her sharp blue eyes studying Rebecca with unconcealed hostility. "So you're the woman my brother was planning to marry. How convenient that you arrived just after his death to claim his property." The accusations stung, but Rebecca recognized the grief beneath Victoria's anger. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Garrett. Thomas seemed like a good man from his letters." He was naive about women, apparently. Victoria's voice was cold as winter. "Steele, I've come to settle his affairs and ensure his legacy isn't squandered by some opportunistic mail-order bride." Martha shifted uncomfortably. "Ladies, perhaps we should discuss this inside." "There's nothing to discuss," Victoria interrupted. "I'm Thomas's only living relative, which means I inherit his property. This woman has no legal claim to anything." Rebecca felt her carefully laid plans crumbling. If Victoria took control of Thomas's estate, the evidence against the consortium would disappear forever. "Your brother left specific instructions. My brother was a romantic fool who got himself killed, chasing fantasies in these god-forsaken mountains." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Did you know he sent me letters for months talking about his mail-order bride and how happy he was going to be? He died believing some woman he'd never met actually cared about him instead of his money." The pain in Victoria's voice revealed the truth. She wasn't just angry about inheritance rights. She was grieving a brother who died alone, and Rebecca represented everything she blamed for his death. "Miss Garrett," Rebecca said carefully, "there are things about your brother's death that you need to know. It wasn't an accident." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Of course it wasn't an accident. He was an inexperienced dreamer playing at being a miner. His recklessness killed him, and now you want to profit from it. Someone murdered him." The words hung in the air like gunshots. Martha gasped, but Victoria's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Before Rebecca could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Coleman riding hard toward the cabin, his face grim with urgency. He dismounted quickly and hurried to the door. "Ladies, we've got trouble in town. There's been another death. Diego Morales was found this morning behind the saloon. Looks like he fell and hit his head, but—" He paused, looking directly at Rebecca. "But some folks are saying he was asking questions about Thomas's death yesterday." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Diego had been killed because he'd helped her, because he'd given her Thomas's key and told her about seeing the consortium men at the mine. The conspiracy was eliminating witnesses. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you privately," she said. Victoria stepped between them. "Anything concerning my brother's affairs should be discussed in my presence. I'm his legal heir." "Miss Garrett," Coleman said diplomatically, "why don't you come into town with me? We can sort out the legal matters at my office while Miss Matthews gathers her things. The paperwork will take some time anyway." After they left, Rebecca acted quickly. She gathered Thomas's hidden documents, the key Diego had given her, and her few personal possessions. The trip to Phoenix couldn't wait. Too many people were dying, and she might be next. As she prepared to leave through the back of the cabin, she heard horses approaching again. Peering through the window, her heart sank. Brenfield and Whitlock had returned, this time with 4 armed men. They weren't here to make offers. She slipped out the back window and made her way toward the rocks behind the cabin, carrying only Thomas's papers and the key. From her hiding place, she watched the men surround the building. "Search everything," Brenfield ordered. "Garrett was too careful not to keep records. If they're not in the mine, they're here." "What about the woman?" one of the men asked. "She's in town with the sheriff, dealing with the sister," Whitlock replied. "This gives us time to find what we need without interference." Rebecca watched them tear apart Thomas's cabin, searching for the very documents she now carried. They found the loose floorboard where she discovered the first papers, but the hiding place was empty. Their frustration was evident as they realized the most important evidence had already been moved. "Garrett was smarter than we thought," Brentfield muttered. "He must have hidden copies somewhere else, or given them to someone," Whitlock suggested. "That Mexican worker was asking too many questions. Good thing we dealt with him." Hearing them casually discuss Diego's murder filled Rebecca with rage and determination. These men had killed Thomas, murdered Diego, and would eliminate her without hesitation if they discovered she had the evidence they sought. After they left, she remained hidden until nightfall, then made her way toward town on foot. She couldn't risk the main road, so she followed deer trails through the canyon, moving slowly in the darkness. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain across the desert landscape. By the time she reached Copper Ridge, she was soaked and exhausted. The town was quiet, except for light spilling from the saloon and the sheriff's office. She needed help, but couldn't be sure who to trust. Diego had warned her to trust no one except him, and now he was dead. As she approached the sheriff's office, she overheard voices through the partially open window. Coleman was speaking with someone, and what she heard made her freeze in place. "The situation is getting complicated, Mr. Brentfield. The sister's arrival changes things. Victoria Garrett has legal authority over Thomas's estate, and she's asking uncomfortable questions about his death." Brentfield's voice was calm but menacing. "Sheriff, your cooperation has been well compensated over the years. I trust you'll find ways to manage Miss Garrett's curiosity, just as you've managed other inconvenient situations. I've looked the other way on land disputes and claim jumpers, but this is different. If Thomas was murdered, Thomas Garrett died in a mining accident. That's what your report says, and that's what happened. The territorial government relies on the consortium's investment in this region. Any investigation that threatens that investment threatens everyone's livelihood, including yours." Rebecca realized with horror that Sheriff Coleman was part of the conspiracy. The one person in town she'd thought she could trust had been bought by the consortium. Thomas's murder had been covered up with official sanction. She backed away from the window and made her way toward the general store, hoping Martha Henderson might offer shelter. But as she approached, she saw lights in the store and voices inside. Through the window, she watched Martha serving coffee to Victoria Garrett and two men she didn't recognize, men wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as territorial officials or federal agents. Hiding behind a water barrel, she listened to their conversation. "Miss Garrett, your brother's correspondence suggests he suspected fraud in regional mining operations," one of the men was saying. "We've been investigating the Territorial Mining Consortium for several months, based on similar reports from other areas." Victoria looked up sharply. "What kind of fraud?" "Systematic acquisition of valuable claims through intimidation, false documentation, and in some cases, elimination of claim holders," the second man replied. "Your brother wasn't the first prospector to die under suspicious circumstances after discovering significant ore deposits. Are you saying Thomas was murdered?" "We believe so, yes. We also believe he documented his findings and may have left evidence that could expose the entire operation. We need to find that evidence before the consortium destroys it." Rebecca realized these men were federal marshals, exactly who Thomas had wanted her to contact. But Victoria's next words changed everything. "The mail-order bride," Victoria said suddenly. "Rebecca Matthews. She claimed Thomas left specific instructions. What if he gave the evidence to her?" "Where is Miss Matthews now?" one of the marshals asked. "I don't know. She was at the cabin this morning, but when I returned from town, she was gone. Her belongings were gone too. Miss Garrett, we need to find her immediately. If she has your brother's evidence and the consortium realizes it, her life is in extreme danger." As if summoned by their words, the sound of horses approaching fast echoed through the town. Rebecca pressed deeper into the shadows as Brenfield and his men rode up to the general store. They dismounted quickly and entered without knocking. "Gentlemen, Miss Garrett," Brenfield said with false courtesy, "I understand you're asking questions about Thomas Garrett's death." One of the marshals stood slowly. "Mr. Brenfield, I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hayes. This is Marshal John Crawford. We're conducting a federal investigation into territorial mining operations." Brenfield's expression didn't change, but Rebecca could see the tension in his posture. "Of course, the consortium is always happy to cooperate with federal authorities, though I'm surprised by your interest in a simple mining accident." "It's not so simple anymore," Marshal Hayes replied. "We have evidence suggesting systematic fraud and murder throughout the territory, including Thomas Garrett's death. That's a serious accusation. I assume you have substantial proof to support such claims." "We will soon. Thomas Garrett documented his findings thoroughly before his death. Those documents will provide all the evidence we need." Brenfield's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid Mr. Garrett's records were destroyed in the mining accident. Nothing survived the cave-in." "Perhaps, but we have reason to believe he kept copies elsewhere, possibly with someone he trusted." The conversation was becoming a deadly chess match, with each side probing for information while revealing as little as possible. Rebecca understood that she held the key piece, literally, that could determine the outcome. Victoria spoke up. "The mail-order bride mentioned Thomas left specific instructions. She might have them. Miss Matthews is no longer in the area," Brenfield said quickly. "I believe she returned to Chicago after realizing the difficulties of frontier life." "Marshal," Crawford smiled coldly. "Interesting. Our information suggests she's still in Copper Ridge. In fact, we believe she may be trying to reach Phoenix with evidence that could destroy your entire operation." The standoff was escalating rapidly. Rebecca realized the marshals were bluffing, trying to force Brenfield into revealing information, but their strategy was putting her in immediate danger. If Brenfield believed she was heading to Phoenix with evidence, he'd send every man he had to stop her. As she considered her options, a new voice cut through the night. Sheriff Coleman, arriving with several deputies. "Marshals, Mr. Brenfield," Coleman said, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand there's been some confusion about federal jurisdiction in this matter." "No confusion at all, Sheriff," Marshal Hayes replied. "This is a federal investigation into interstate crimes. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not required." Coleman's response revealed whose side he was truly on. "I'm afraid I'll need to see proper documentation before allowing any federal investigation in my jurisdiction." Territorial law doesn't supersede federal authority," Marshal Crawford interrupted. "We have proper warrants and documentation." The situation was spiraling toward confrontation. Rebecca counted the men. Brenfield had brought 4 armed associates. Coleman had 3 deputies, and there were only 2 marshals. If shooting started, the federal agents would be outnumbered and outgunned. But as she watched, she noticed something the others had missed. Victoria Garrett had quietly moved toward the back of the store, positioning herself near what looked like a rifle rack. Thomas's sister was preparing to choose sides, and her choice might determine who survived the night. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the tense scene through the store windows. In that flickering light, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the general store, carrying Thomas's evidence and knowing that her appearance would force everyone to show their true intentions. As she reached for the door handle, thunder crashed overhead, masking the sound of her approach. What happened in the next few minutes would determine not only her survival, but whether Thomas Garrett's murder would be avenged or covered up forever. The door to Henderson's general store opened with a creak that cut through the tense silence like a blade. Every head turned as Rebecca stepped inside, water dripping from her rain-soaked clothes. Thomas's leather portfolio clutched against her chest. "Good evening," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believe you've all been looking for me." The reaction was immediate and revealing. Brenfield's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself. Sheriff Coleman's face went pale. The two marshals exchanged glances of relief mixed with concern. Victoria Garrett stared at her with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been respect. Marshal Hayes recovered first. "Miss Matthews, we're Deputy U.S. Marshals Hayes and Crawford. We need to speak with you about Thomas Garrett's death and evidence he may have left behind." "I know exactly who you are and why you're here," Rebecca replied, surprising everyone. "The question is whether you're all prepared to hear the truth about what's been happening in this territory, or if some of you would prefer to keep profiting from murder and theft." Brenfield stepped forward, his facade of civility cracking. "Miss Matthews, you're clearly overwrought from your ordeal. Perhaps you should rest before making wild accusations." Wild accusations. Rebecca opened the portfolio and pulled out a handful of documents. Like the geological surveys proving Thomas discovered a gold vein worth millions, or the correspondence documenting your systematic murder of claim holders throughout the territory, or perhaps the assay reports showing ore samples worth 18 ounces per ton. The number hit like a physical blow. Even Victoria gasped. She understood enough about mining to know what 18 ounces per ton meant. Martha Henderson, who had been quietly serving coffee and trying to stay invisible, dropped her cup with a crash. Marshal Crawford leaned forward. "Miss Matthews, are you saying you have Thomas Garrett's geological documentation?" "I have everything," Rebecca said, her confidence growing as she saw the fear in Brenfield's eyes. "Maps of the entire vein system, proof of your illegal land acquisitions, witness statements about suspicious deaths, and correspondence with assay offices that will verify every claim." Sheriff Coleman finally spoke, his voice strained. "Now hold on, miss. Those are serious accusations requiring serious proof." "Sheriff, your cooperation with the consortium is documented too," Rebecca interrupted, pulling out another set of papers. "Thomas kept meticulous records of everyone involved in the conspiracy, including law enforcement officials who looked the other way in exchange for payment." Coleman's face flushed red. "That's slander." "It's evidence," Marshal Hayes said firmly, extending his hand toward Rebecca. "Miss Matthews, for your safety and the integrity of our investigation, I need you to turn those documents over to federal custody immediately." But Rebecca stepped back, still clutching the portfolio. "How do I know you're really federal marshals? How do I know you won't disappear like Thomas and Diego did?" Victoria Garrett suddenly spoke up. "She's right to be cautious. In the past hour, I've learned that nothing in this town is what it appears to be." She looked directly at her brother's intended bride. "But Thomas trusted you enough to leave you those documents. That tells me something about both of you." Marshal Crawford reached into his jacket slowly, producing official credentials and a telegram. "Miss Matthews, this wire from the U.S. Marshal's office in Phoenix confirms our authority and mission. We've been tracking the consortium's activities across 3 territories." As Rebecca examined the documents, Brenfield made his move. "Enough of this charade," he snarled, drawing his gun. "Those papers belong to the consortium. Garrett stole proprietary geological information, and we're here to recover stolen property." The general store erupted into chaos. Coleman and his deputies drew their weapons, but instead of supporting the marshals, they aimed at the federal agents. Victoria Garrett grabbed the rifle she'd positioned herself near, working the lever action with practiced efficiency that surprised everyone. "Nobody moves," Victoria commanded, the rifle trained on Brenfield. "My brother may have been naive about some things, but he taught me to shoot when we were children in California. I don't miss." Martha Henderson screamed and dove behind the counter. Rebecca found herself in the center of a deadly standoff, With guns pointed in every direction and her evidence portfolio, the prize everyone was fighting for. Marshal Hayes kept his weapon trained on Coleman. "Sheriff, you're interfering with a federal investigation. Stand down immediately." "This is my jurisdiction," Coleman replied, though sweat beaded on his forehead. "I won't have federal agents disrupting our community based on the ravings of a hysterical woman." Hysterical. Rebecca's voice cut through the tension like ice. "Thomas Garrett spent 18 months documenting your crimes. Diego Morales died because he told me the truth about what he saw the day Thomas was murdered. I've spent the last 3 days discovering that this entire town is built on fraud and murder." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "You want to know what Thomas found? He didn't just discover gold. He discovered that the Territorial Mining Consortium has been systematically murdering claim holders and bribing officials to cover it up. He found evidence of at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 3 years, all connected to valuable mining claims that somehow ended up in consortium hands." Brenfield's composure finally cracked completely. "Kill them all," he ordered. His men. "We'll make it look like the marshals went rogue and started shooting. No witnesses." But Victoria Garrett was faster than anyone expected. Her rifle barked once, and Brenfield's gun flew from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding arm. The shot triggered pandemonium. Coleman fired at Marshal Hayes, who dove behind a stack of flour sacks. One of Brenfield's men shot at Victoria, who rolled behind the counter with Martha Henderson. Another consortium gunman aimed at Rebecca, but Marshal Crawford tackled her to the floor as bullets shattered the window behind where she'd been standing. In the chaos, Rebecca saw something that changed everything. As Coleman reloaded his gun, preparing to finish off the marshals, one of his own deputies, a young man she'd seen around town but never spoken to, suddenly turned his weapon on the corrupt sheriff. "Drop it, Coleman!" the deputy shouted. "I won't be part of murder." Coleman spun around, his face twisted with rage. "Danny, you fool! They'll destroy this town if they expose the consortium. They'll destroy us if we keep covering up murders," Deputy Danny Morrison replied. "My conscience won't let me go any further." The momentary distraction gave Marshal Hayes the opening he needed. His shot took Coleman's center mass, and the corrupt sheriff collapsed behind an overturned table. His career of looking the other way finally ended. But the fight was far from over. Brenfield, despite his wounded wrist, had retrieved a backup gun and was advancing on Rebecca's position. "Those documents die with you," he snarled. Victoria Garrett appeared from behind the counter like an avenging angel, her rifle aimed at Brenfield's head. "They're Thomas's legacy, and you've already stolen enough from my family. Your brother was a meddling fool who didn't understand business." Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger. "My brother was worth 10 of you." But before she could fire, the store's back door exploded inward. More men poured through, not consortium gunmen, but federal agents. The marshal's backup had finally arrived, summoned by telegraph earlier that evening. "Federal agents! Everyone drop your weapons!" The remaining consortium men, outnumbered and outgunned, finally surrendered. Brenfield, clutching his shattered wrist and staring at the ruin of his criminal empire, slowly placed his gun on the floor. As the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, Rebecca found herself sitting on a flour sack, still clutching Thomas's evidence portfolio. The documents that had cost so many lives were finally in the right hands. Marshal Hayes approached her carefully. "Miss Matthews, are you injured?" She shook her head, though her hands were trembling from shock and exhaustion. "I'm alive. That's more than I expected an hour ago." Victoria Garrett sat down beside her, the rifle finally lowered. "I owe you an apology. When I arrived this morning, I thought you were just another opportunist trying to profit from Thomas's death." "I thought the same thing at first," Rebecca admitted, but Thomas left me more than I bargained for. He left me the responsibility to see justice done. Deputy Morrison, now apparently the senior law enforcement officer left standing, approached with one of the federal agents. "Ma'am, we'll need your full statement about everything you've discovered. This is going to be the biggest corruption case in territorial history." As the immediate danger passed, the full scope of what they'd uncovered began to sink in. The Territorial Mining Consortium's criminal network extended far beyond Copper Ridge, involving politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials across 3 territories. Thomas Garrett's meticulous documentation would expose a conspiracy that had stolen millions in mining wealth and cost dozens of lives. But even as federal agents secured the evidence and arrested the surviving conspirators, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't found everyone involved. Brenfield and Coleman were caught, but criminal organizations this extensive didn't operate without protection at the highest levels of territorial government. Victoria seemed to read her thoughts. "It's not over, is it? The immediate danger is past," Marshal Crawford said, overhearing. "But you're right, this investigation will take months to complete, and there will be powerful people who want it stopped." As dawn broke over Copper Ridge, painting the storm-cleared sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca stood outside the general store, watching federal agents load evidence into wagons. The key to Thomas's safety deposit box in Phoenix was still in her pocket, and she suspected it contained even more damaging information about the conspiracy. Thomas Garrett had been more than a lonely prospector looking for love through mail order. A bride correspondence. He'd been a trained geologist, a meticulous investigator, and ultimately a man who died trying to expose a criminal conspiracy that threatened the entire territorial mining industry. Now, his intended bride, a woman he'd never met but had trusted with his life's work, would carry on his mission. The gold mine was valuable, but justice for his murder was priceless. Martha Henderson emerged from the store, surveying the damage to her business. "What happens now?" she asked. Victoria Garrett looked at Rebecca, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared danger and mutual respect. "Now we make sure everyone who participated in this conspiracy pays for what they've done," Victoria said. "And we make sure Thomas's discovery benefits the people he cared about, not the criminals who killed him," Rebecca added. As the federal agents prepared for the journey to Phoenix with their prisoners and evidence, Rebecca realized her life had changed completely in the span of a week. She'd come to Copper Ridge as a desperate woman with no choices, seeking marriage to a stranger as her only escape from poverty. Now she was the heir to a fortune, the keeper of evidence that would reshape territorial law enforcement, and a woman who'd proven she could face down killers without flinching. Thomas Garrett had given her more than gold. He'd given her the chance to become someone she'd never imagined she could be. But as the wagons rolled out of Copper Ridge toward Phoenix, carrying the evidence that would destroy the consortium, Rebecca noticed a lone horseman watching from the canyon rim. Even with Brenfield and his men captured, someone was still keeping track of their movements. The conspiracy was larger than they'd realized, and the fight for justice was far from over. 3 days after the shootout at Henderson's General Store, Rebecca found herself in a Phoenix hotel room that cost more per night than she'd earned in a month at the Chicago textile mill. The federal government was covering her expenses while she provided testimony for what newspapers were calling the largest territorial corruption scandal in American history. The contents of Thomas's safety deposit box had exceeded even her expectations. Beyond additional geological surveys and ore samples worth a fortune, he'd maintained correspondence with mining engineers across the West, documenting similar suspicious deaths and illegal claim acquisitions from California to Colorado. The Territorial Mining Consortium wasn't just a regional criminal organization. It was part of a nationwide network systematically looting America's mineral wealth. But Thomas's most shocking discovery was contained in a sealed envelope marked "For Federal Authorities Only." Inside were photographs and documents proving that Senator Harrison Wade, chairman of the Senate Committee on Territorial Affairs, had been receiving payments from the consortium in exchange for blocking federal mining investigations and approving fraudulent land patents. Victoria Garrett sat across from Rebecca in the hotel's parlor, examining copies of the photographs. "My brother was more thorough than I ever imagined. These pictures show Senator Wade meeting with consortium executives in San Francisco last year." "How did Thomas get these?" Rebecca wondered aloud. "He hired a private detective agency," Victoria replied, reading through the correspondence. "Apparently he suspected the corruption went beyond local officials, so he started investigating territorial politicians. The detective followed Wade for 3 months, documenting his meetings and financial transactions." Marshal Crawford entered the room, his expression grim. "Ladies, we have a problem. Senator Wade has been informed about the investigation, and he's using his influence to shut it down. The territorial governor received orders this morning to cease all cooperation with federal authorities." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "Can they do that?" "Legally, it's complicated. Practically, it means our witnesses are being intimidated, evidence is disappearing, and the consortium's remaining leaders are being warned to flee the territory." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "They're going to get away with murdering my brother." "Not if we can help it," Crawford replied. "But we need to move fast. The hearing before the territorial judge is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If we can present enough evidence to convince him to order arrests and seizure of consortium assets, we might be able to prevent a complete cover-up." That evening, as Rebecca prepared her testimony for the hearing, a knock came at her hotel room door. She opened it cautiously to find a well-dressed woman in her 40s, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. "Miss Matthews, I'm Catherine Preston from the San Francisco Chronicle, and this is my photographer James Sullivan. We'd like to speak with you about the territorial mining scandal." Rebecca hesitated. The marshals had warned her about talking to reporters, but something in Catherine Preston's manner suggested she might be an ally rather than a threat. "May I ask why the San Francisco Chronicle is interested in a territorial mining story?" Catherine smiled grimly. "Because Senator Wade owns stock in several California mining companies, and we have reason to believe the consortium's criminal activities extend well beyond Arizona territory. Your testimony tomorrow could expose corruption that reaches into some of the most powerful families on the West Coast." Against her better judgment, Rebecca invited them in. Catherine Preston proved to be a skilled interviewer who understood the technical aspects of mining law and territorial politics. More importantly, she already knew details about the consortium's operations that hadn't been made public. "Miss Matthews, you should know that you're not the first person to try exposing this conspiracy," Catherine said. 2 years ago, a mining engineer named Robert Fleming discovered similar evidence in Nevada territory. He was found dead in a hotel room in Carson City the night before he was supposed to testify before a federal grand jury. The implication was chilling. Even under federal protection, Rebecca might not be safe. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "We have information suggesting the consortium has been systematically targeting mail-order brides and widows of deceased miners. Women who inherit valuable claims but don't understand their worth become easy targets for intimidation or elimination." Rebecca realized how close she'd come to becoming another statistic. If she'd accepted Brenfield's initial offer of $500 and left Copper Ridge, Thomas's evidence would have disappeared forever. James Sullivan, the photographer, had been quietly setting up his equipment during their conversation. "Miss Matthews, we'd like to photograph you with some of the evidence for tomorrow's newspaper. The American public needs to see the face of the woman who exposed this conspiracy." As the interview concluded, Catherine Preston pulled Rebecca aside. "There's one more thing you should know. Senator Wade has considerable influence with federal judges, including the one hearing your case tomorrow. Judge Hamilton Montgomery has financial ties to several mining companies, and he's known for protecting business interests over individual rights. Are you saying the hearing is rigged? I'm saying you need to be prepared for the possibility that legal channels alone won't be enough to get justice for Thomas Garrett's murder." That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She stood at her hotel window, looking out at the gas-lit streets of Phoenix, wondering if Thomas had felt this same sense of overwhelming responsibility when he'd started gathering evidence against the consortium. One man's determination to expose the truth had already cost him his life and endangered everyone who tried to help him. The next morning, the territorial courthouse was packed with reporters, mining executives, government officials, and curious citizens. Rebecca had never seen so many people gathered for a legal proceeding, and the attention made her nervous. Judge Montgomery was exactly what Catherine Preston had led her to expect: an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to privilege, and the cold eyes of someone who valued property rights over human rights. His opening statements made his bias clear. "This court will hear testimony regarding alleged irregularities in territorial mining operations," he announced. "However, I want to emphasize that we will not tolerate wild accusations against respected businessmen based on the theories of a dead prospector and the testimony of a woman with obvious financial motives." Marshall Crawford presented the federal case methodically, introducing Thomas's geological surveys, the consortium's forged documents, and witness statements from surviving miners who'd been intimidated into selling their claims below market value. The evidence was overwhelming, but Judge Montgomery seemed determined to find reasons to exclude or dismiss each piece of testimony. When Rebecca finally took the witness stand, she felt the weight of everyone's expectations. This was her chance to speak for Thomas, for Diego, for all the miners who died to protect the consortium's profits. "Miss Matthews," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you came to possess Thomas Garrett's mining records." She told the story simply and directly. The train journey to Copper Ridge, Thomas's death, her discovery of his hidden evidence, and the attempts to silence her. As she spoke, she noticed several men in expensive suits taking notes and whispering among themselves. These weren't reporters or curious citizens. They were consortium representatives monitoring the proceedings. The defense attorney, a smooth-talking man named Jonathan Pierce, who clearly represented powerful interests, began his cross-examination with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Matthews, isn't it true that you traveled to Arizona Territory specifically to marry Thomas Garrett for his money?" "I responded to his advertisement for a mail-order bride, yes, but I had no knowledge of his mining discovery until after his death." "How convenient. And isn't it true that you fabricated this elaborate conspiracy theory to justify claiming valuable mining property that doesn't legally belong to you?" Victoria Garrett stood up in the gallery. "Objection. Thomas left specific instructions." Judge Montgomery banged his gavel. "Miss Garrett, you will remain seated and silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Pierce continued his attack. "Miss Matthews, you've presented no concrete proof that Thomas Garrett's death was anything other than a tragic mining accident. These documents you claim to possess could have been forged by anyone seeking to profit from his misfortune." "Then explain the ore samples," Rebecca replied firmly. "Explain the assay reports from independent laboratories. Explain why Brenfield and his men tried to kill federal marshals to prevent this evidence from being presented." "Alleged attempts," Pierce corrected. And even if we accept your version of events in Copper Ridge, that doesn't prove a territorial-wide conspiracy or justify federal interference in local mining disputes. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with witness after witness providing testimony about the consortium's criminal activities. But Judge Montgomery's questions and rulings made it clear he intended to minimize the federal case and protect the consortium's interests. As the day wore on, Rebecca noticed something troubling. Several key witnesses who were supposed to testify, minors, who'd been intimidated by the consortium, officials who'd witnessed document forgeries, had failed to appear. Marshal Crawford's growing concern suggested they weren't simply late. During a recess, Catherine Preston approached Rebecca in the courthouse hallway. "3 of your witnesses were found dead this morning in their hotel rooms, apparent suicides according to local police." The message was clear. The consortium was eliminating anyone who might provide damaging testimony, even under federal protection. Victoria Garrett joined them, her face pale with worry. "They're going to get away with it, aren't they? All those deaths, including Thomas's murder, and these criminals will walk free because they have enough money and political influence to corrupt the entire legal system." "Not if I can help it," Rebecca said with sudden determination. She'd made a decision that surprised even herself. That evening, instead of returning to her hotel, she walked to the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle's Phoenix Bureau. Catherine Preston was still working, preparing her story about the hearing for the next day's edition. "Miss Preston, I want to give you an exclusive interview. Everything. Thomas's complete evidence files, the consortium's criminal network, Senator Wade's involvement, Judge Montgomery's bias. I want the American people to know the truth, even if the territorial legal system won't provide justice." Catherine looked up from her typewriter, immediately understanding the implications. "Miss Matthews, if we publish everything, you'll become a target for assassination. These people have killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to eliminate you." "They're already trying to kill me," Rebecca replied. "At least this way, the truth will survive even if I don't." As she began dictating Thomas's story to the reporter, Rebecca realized she'd found her purpose. She might have come to Arizona territory as a desperate woman seeking marriage for survival, but she was leaving as someone who understood that some things were worth risking everything to protect. Justice for Thomas Garrett. Truth about the consortium's crimes, and the hope that other women in similar situations would have better choices than she'd been given. Outside the newspaper office, a man watched from the shadows, taking notes about everyone who entered and left the building. The conspiracy's reach extended even into the press, and Rebecca's decision to go public would bring dangers she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since stepping off the train in Copper Ridge, she felt like she was finally doing what Thomas would have wanted. His legacy wouldn't be just gold buried in the Arizona mountains. It would be the truth, published where everyone could read it, preserved where no amount of corruption could destroy it. The final battle for justice was about to begin. The San Francisco Chronicle's morning edition hit the streets with a headline that would reshape American mining forever. "Territorial conspiracy exposed. Mail-order bride reveals murders, corruption, and senator's criminal network." Catherine Preston's investigation, combined with Rebecca's testimony and Thomas's evidence, filled 4 full pages with details that made the territorial hearing look like amateur theater. Rebecca woke in her Phoenix hotel room to find Marshal Crawford. Pounding on her door, newspapers scattered across the hallway floor behind him, his expression mixed admiration with terror. "Miss Matthews, what have you done?" He thrust the Chronicle into her hands. "This story names names, provides specific evidence, and directly accuses a sitting U.S. senator of murder conspiracy. Within hours, this will be reprinted in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The article was everything Rebecca had hoped for and more. Catherine Preston had connected the territorial mining conspiracy to similar operations in Nevada, California, and Colorado, revealing a criminal network that had stolen millions in mineral wealth while leaving a trail of suspicious deaths across the American West. Thomas's meticulous documentation provided the foundation, but Preston's additional investigation had uncovered the full scope of the corruption. Senator Wade's response has already been issued, Crawford continued, showing her a telegraph message. He's calling the story malicious fabrications by a deranged woman seeking to profit from tragedy and demanding a congressional investigation of the Chronicle's irresponsible journalism. Victoria Garrett burst into the room without knocking, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Rebecca, you magnificent fool, do you realize what you've started? Telegraph messages are pouring into every major newspaper in the country. The New York Times wants to interview you. The Chicago Tribune is sending reporters to Arizona Territory. You've made this a national scandal." But their celebration was premature. As they talked, Deputy Morrison from Copper Ridge arrived with news that changed everything. "Ladies, Marshal Crawford, I rode hard from Copper Ridge with urgent information. 3 hours after the Chronicle story broke, a company of territorial militia surrounded the town. They're calling it Federal Overreach Prevention, but they've arrested every federal agent left in the area and seized all remaining evidence." Crawford's face went white. "On whose authority?" "Governor Blackwood's direct order, backed by Senator Wade's emergency powers declaration. They're claiming the federal investigation was conducted without proper territorial consent, and all evidence obtained is inadmissible." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The consortium wasn't just fighting in court anymore. They were using political power to wage war against federal authority itself. "There's more," Morrison continued grimly. "Judge Montgomery issued a warrant for your arrest, Miss Matthews. You're charged with theft of mining property, fraud, and conspiracy to defame territorial officials. The warrant authorizes your immediate extradition to territorial custody." Rebecca sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the speed at which her situation had deteriorated. Publishing the truth had made her a fugitive from the very justice system she'd hoped to reform. Victoria grabbed her arm. "We have to get you out of Arizona Territory immediately. If they arrest you, you'll never survive long enough to testify before Congress." "Congress?" Rebecca looked up hopefully. Marshal Crawford nodded slowly. "The Chronicle story has forced congressional action. Senator Wade's political enemies have been waiting for an opportunity to destroy him, and this scandal provides perfect ammunition. Congressman William Denton of New York has called for immediate hearings before the House Committee on Territorial Affairs. But first, we have to keep you alive long enough to testify," Victoria added. Their escape plan was necessarily simple. Morrison would guide them through back trails to the railroad depot in Flagstaff, avoiding the main roads where territorial militia might be watching. From there, they could take the train to California, beyond the reach of Arizona territorial warrants. As they prepared to leave Phoenix, Catherine Preston arrived with final editions of newspapers from across the country. The story had exploded beyond even her expectations. "The Washington Post is calling for Senator Wade's immediate resignation," she reported. "The Boston Globe has editorialized about territorial corruption undermining American mineral development. Most importantly, the New York Times is publishing a series of investigative articles based on additional evidence they've uncovered independently." She handed Rebecca a telegram. "This came for you this morning. It's from Congressman Denton's office." The message was brief but significant. "Miss Matthews, your testimony is vital to congressional investigation of territorial mining corruption. Federal protection authorized. Please proceed to Washington immediately." Congressman W. Denton, Chairman, House Committee on Territorial Affairs. As they left Phoenix in Morrison's wagon, heading north toward Flagstaff through desert trails, Rebecca reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She'd arrived in Arizona territory as a desperate woman with $12 and no prospects. Now she was fleeing as a key witness in a congressional investigation that would reshape American mining law. The journey to Flagstaff took 2 days, traveling carefully to avoid territorial patrols. Along the way, Morrison filled them in on developments. Back in Copper Ridge, the federal agents they arrested have been released after diplomatic pressure from Washington, he reported. But the consortium moved fast to destroy evidence and intimidate remaining witnesses. Martha Henderson closed her store and left town. Several miners who'd agreed to testify have disappeared entirely. "What about Thomas's mine?" Victoria asked. "Sealed, by territorial order, pending proper legal determination of ownership, which means the consortium will claim it eventually, once this scandal dies down." But Victoria smiled grimly. "They can seal the mine, but they can't seal what Thomas already removed." According to his records, he extracted nearly 50 pounds of high-grade ore over the past 6 months. That gold is sitting in bank vaults in Phoenix and Tucson, documented and assayed. It's worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. The train journey from Flagstaff to Los Angeles was tense but uneventful. However, as they prepared to board the eastbound express to Chicago and then Washington, they discovered they weren't traveling alone. A man in an expensive suit approached them on the platform, flanked by 2 others who were obviously bodyguards. "Miss Matthews? I'm Attorney General Harrison Blackwood, Governor Blackwood's son. I have a proposition for you." The name sent chills through Rebecca. The territorial governor's son had come personally to make some kind of deal. "My father and Senator Wade are prepared to offer you a very generous settlement," Blackwood continued. $5,000 plus safe passage back to Chicago in exchange for your silence about this entire matter. You keep the money, we keep our reputations, and everyone goes home happy. "What about justice for Thomas's murder?" Victoria demanded. "Thomas Garrett died in a mining accident. Unfortunate, but not criminal. As for the other allegations, they're based on misunderstandings that can be resolved without destroying innocent people's careers." Rebecca looked at the man who represented everything she'd learned to despise about the territorial system. Corruption disguised as respectability, murder dismissed as business necessity, and justice available only to those who could afford to buy it. "Mr. Blackwood, your father's administration has covered up multiple murders, stolen millions in mineral wealth, and corrupted the entire territorial legal system. Thomas Garrett died because he discovered evidence of those crimes. I won't be bought off like one of your corrupt officials." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Miss Matthews, you're making a serious mistake. The territorial government has resources you can't imagine. Even if you reach Washington, even if you testify before Congress, we can make your life very difficult. For a very long time. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a way out of a situation that will only get worse for you. Take the money and disappear. It's the smart choice." Victoria stepped between them. "The smart choice would be for you to convince your father to resign before Congress exposes the full extent of his complicity in these crimes." As the train whistle announced boarding, Blackwood made one final attempt. $5,000 is more money than you'll see in 10 years of whatever work you can find back east. Think carefully about throwing that away for the sake of a dead man's reputation. But Rebecca was already walking toward the train, Thomas's evidence portfolio clutched firmly in her hands. "Mr. Blackwood, some things are worth more than money. Your family will learn that when Congress investigates how many people died to protect your father's political career." The journey to Washington took 5 days, with changes of trains in Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago. At each stop, they were met by federal marshals who confirmed that congressional protection was real and active. The story had grown beyond territorial politics into a national scandal that threatened to reshape federal oversight of mining in all Western territories. When they finally arrived at Washington's Union Station, Rebecca was amazed by the crowd of reporters waiting for them. The quiet mail-order bride story had become front-page news across America, and she was now one of the most recognizable women in the country. Congressman Denton met them personally, a distinguished man in his 60s who had spent 20 years fighting territorial corruption in various forms. "Miss Matthews, your courage in exposing this conspiracy has provided Congress with the ammunition we need to reform territorial administration completely. Your testimony will be heard not just by the House Committee, but by the full Congress and the American people." The congressional hearing lasted 3 days and was attended by senators, representatives, cabinet members, and reporters from every major newspaper in the country. Rebecca told Thomas's story from beginning to end, presenting his evidence methodically and answering questions about everything from geological surveys to murdered witnesses. Senator Wade himself appeared to defend his reputation, but his performance was disastrous. Confronted with photographs, financial records, and correspondence proving his complicity in the conspiracy, he could only offer weak denials and personal attacks on Rebecca's credibility. The committee's final report, issued 2 weeks later, was damning beyond what anyone had expected. Senator Wade was expelled from the Senate and faced federal criminal charges. Governor Blackwood was removed from office and also indicted. The Territorial Mining Consortium was dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims' families. Most importantly for Rebecca, the committee ruled that Thomas Garrett's mining claim was legally valid and belonged to his estate. Since he died before their marriage, territorial law granted inheritance rights to his intended bride, who had acted to preserve his legacy. 6 months after stepping off the train in Copper Ridge, Rebecca found herself back in Arizona territory as the legal owner of one of the richest gold mines in American history. But this time, she wasn't alone. Victoria Garrett had become her partner in both business and friendship, managing the mining operation while Rebecca handled the legal and political aspects of their unexpected empire. Deputy Morrison had been appointed the new sheriff of Copper Ridge, replacing the corrupt Coleman with honest law enforcement. The mine that Thomas had discovered yielded even more gold than his surveys had predicted. Within a year, it was producing enough wealth to transform Copper Ridge from a dying desert town into a thriving community with schools, hospitals, and opportunities for families who wanted to build honest lives. But Rebecca's greatest satisfaction came from the changes her testimony had sparked throughout the West. Congressional reforms had established federal oversight of territorial mining operations, making it much harder for criminal conspiracies to operate with impunity. Other women who found themselves in situations similar to hers now had legal protections and resources that hadn't existed before. As she stood on the porch of the house she'd built on the hill overlooking Thomas's mine, watching the sun set over the desert that had nearly killed her, Rebecca thought about the man whose letters had brought her to this place. Thomas Garrett had sought a wife to share his dreams, but instead he'd found someone to carry on his fight for justice. The mail-order bride who'd come to Arizona territory seeking only survival had become a woman who helped reshape the American West. Thomas's gold had made her wealthy, but his example had made her strong, and in the canyon shadows where enemies had once watched and waited, now stood the foundations of a new town where children played safely and miners worked without fear of mysterious accidents. Justice, Rebecca had learned, was worth more than all the gold in the Arizona mountains. 2 years after the congressional hearings that destroyed the Territorial Mining Consortium, Rebecca stood in her office overlooking the bustling main street of New Copper Ridge, reading a telegram that would change everything once again. The message was from Detective William Hayes of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in Denver. Miss Matthews, urgent we meet regarding new developments in Garrett case. Evidence suggests the conspiracy survived federal prosecution. Your life may be in danger. Arriving at Copper Ridge tomorrow. Trust no one until I arrive. W. Hayes. The telegram slipped from her fingers. She'd believed the nightmare was over, that justice had been served and the criminals punished. But apparently, some serpents had survived the destruction of their nest. Victoria Garrett entered the office, carrying ledgers from the mine's latest production reports. The partnership between the two women had transformed not just their personal fortunes, but the entire region's economy. Their mining operation now employed over 300 workers, and the town had grown from a dusty collection of buildings to a proper community with electric streetlights, a railroad depot, and even a small opera house. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Victoria observed, noticing Rebecca's pale complexion. Rebecca handed her the telegram. Victoria's expression darkened as she read, "I thought we'd destroyed them all." Apparently not. Rebecca moved to the window, looking down at the street where children played outside the new schoolhouse. Detective Hayes wouldn't contact us unless he'd discovered something significant. The question is, who survived and what are they planning? Their conversation was interrupted by Martha Henderson, who had returned to Copper Ridge 6 months earlier to manage the town's new general store and post office. She knocked urgently on the door, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "Ladies, you need to see this." She thrust a newspaper into Victoria's hands. "It's today's edition of the Denver Post." The headline made Rebecca's blood freeze. Mysterious. Death's plague, former mining officials. 3 key witnesses in territorial conspiracy found dead across western states. The article detailed the recent deaths of men who had testified against the consortium during the congressional hearings. Judge Montgomery, who had been serving a federal prison sentence, was found dead in his cell from apparent suicide. Attorney General Harrison Blackwood had died in a suspicious carriage accident in San Francisco. Most disturbing of all, Marshall Crawford, who had led the federal investigation, had been killed in a gunfight with unknown assailants while investigating mining fraud in Colorado. "They're eliminating everyone who testified against them," Victoria whispered. Martha Henderson wrung her hands nervously. "There's more. I've been receiving strange telegrams at the post office, asking about your schedules, your business travel, who visits the mine. I thought they were from potential investors, but now it's clear someone's been gathering intelligence about us," Rebecca finished. "How long has this been going on?" "About 2 months, always different names, different return addresses, but the questions were similar enough that I started keeping copies." Martha pulled folded telegrams from her apron pocket. "I should have told you sooner, but after everything we've been through, I hoped we were past all that danger." As they examined the telegrams, a pattern emerged. Someone had been systematically tracking their movements, learning their routines, and identifying their security measures. Whoever was behind this new threat was being far more careful than Brenfield and his crude consortium had been. Victoria walked to the office safe and retrieved a pistol, something she'd learned to carry after the events 2 years ago. "If they're planning to eliminate us like they did the others, they'll have to work for it." But Rebecca was thinking beyond immediate self-defense. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. The original conspiracy was about stealing mining claims and eliminating competition. Why would anyone continue that fight now when the consortium's been destroyed and the legal reforms have made their old methods impossible?" The answer came the next morning with Detective Hayes's arrival. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent years tracking dangerous criminals. His first words confirmed their worst fears. "Ladies, you're dealing with something much larger than the territorial conspiracy you helped expose. The Territorial Mining Consortium was just one tentacle of a criminal organization that operates throughout the American West. When you destroyed the Arizona operation, you didn't eliminate the beast, you just wounded it." He spread maps and photographs across Rebecca's desk, showing mining operations from California to Colorado. This organization calls itself the Western Mineral Alliance. They've been systematically acquiring valuable mining properties for over a decade, using methods ranging from legal manipulation to outright murder. The territorial conspiracy was their most successful operation, but not their only one. Victoria studied the photographs. How many people have they killed? Conservative estimate, over 40 miners, territorial officials, and federal agents. Across 6 states and territories. They operate through local front organizations like the Consortium, making it difficult to prove the connections between different criminal activities. Rebecca felt sick. "You're saying Thomas's murder was part of something even larger than we realized." "Thomas Garrett wasn't just a threat to the Arizona operation," Hayes confirmed. "His geological expertise and investigative methods posed a danger to their entire network. If he'd been allowed to continue his work, he might have exposed criminal activities from Nevada to New Mexico." The detective pulled out a folder marked "Confidential Pinkerton Investigation." The Alliance learned from the Consortium's mistakes. They're no longer using crude intimidation and obvious corruption. Instead, they're employing sophisticated methods, financial manipulation, legal technicalities, and, when necessary, elimination of threats that looks like accidents or natural causes. "What triggered this new campaign against us?" Victoria asked. Hayes's expression grew grim. 3 months ago, Congress passed the Western Mining Reform Act, largely based on testimony from the territorial hearings. The new law requires federal oversight of all major mining operations and mandates transparency in mineral rights transfers. This threatens to expose Alliance operations throughout the West. "So they blame us for the legislation," Rebecca realized. More than that, the Alliance leadership has decided that eliminating the people responsible for the reforms will send a message to other potential witnesses and investigators. They want to demonstrate that exposing their crimes carries permanent consequences. The scope of the threat was overwhelming. They weren't just dealing with local criminals seeking revenge. They were facing a sophisticated criminal organization with resources and connections across multiple states. Victoria began pacing, her business mind analyzing the situation strategically. If they wanted us dead, they could have acted already. The fact that they're taking time to gather intelligence suggests they're planning something more complex than simple assassination. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Exactly. My investigation suggests they're planning to destroy your reputations and your business empire before eliminating you. They want to discredit everything you've accomplished, making your deaths look like the desperate acts of failed businesswomen rather than murders of heroic witnesses." "How would they accomplish that?" Rebecca asked. "Financial manipulation, legal challenges to your mining rights, planted evidence of fraud or corruption, character assassination through planted newspaper stories. They have the resources to wage a comprehensive campaign that would destroy your lives before taking them." Martha Henderson, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "The new investors who've been asking about partnerships with your mining operation, could they be part of this?" Rebecca's heart sank. Over the past month, several well-dressed men representing Eastern investment firms had approached them about expanding their mining operations through partnerships or buyouts. The offers had been generous, but vague, and something about the representatives had made her uncomfortable, Describe them, Hayes requested. As Martha provided descriptions, Hayes's expression grew increasingly concerned. Those match the profiles of known alliance agents. They've been infiltrating legitimate businesses to gather intelligence and identify vulnerabilities. The revelation that their business had been penetrated by enemy agents made their situation far more precarious. If the Alliance had inside knowledge of their operations, financial records, and security measures, any defensive plan would be compromised from the start. Victoria moved to the window, looking down at the thriving town they'd built. We can't let them destroy what Thomas died to protect. This community, these reforms, the precedent we've set for fighting corruption, it's all at stake. There's something else, Hayes continued. The Alliance isn't just targeting you. They're planning coordinated attacks against everyone who supported the mining reforms. Congressmen, federal marshals, journalists, and other witnesses from various territorial investigations. They want to demonstrate that challenging their power has permanent consequences. The criminal organization was planning what amounted to a terrorist campaign against the American legal system itself. The stakes had grown far beyond personal revenge into an assault on the rule of law in the Western Territories. Rebecca stood slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. Detective Hayes, what do you recommend? Disappear. Change your identities, abandon your business interests, and start new lives somewhere the Alliance can't find you. It's the only way to survive what's coming. But even as he spoke, Hayes could see from their expressions that neither woman would abandon the fight. They'd sacrificed too much and achieved too much to run away when the criminal conspiracy struck back. Victoria voiced what they were both thinking. Running away means letting them win. It means every person who died fighting this conspiracy died for nothing. It means other communities will suffer what Copper Ridge suffered before we exposed the truth. Then you're choosing to fight an organization with unlimited resources, political connections, and a track record of eliminating anyone who threatens their interests, Hayes warned. We fought them before, and won, Rebecca replied, with quiet determination. Thomas Garrett started this fight with nothing but moral courage and careful documentation. We have more resources now, more allies, and more experience with their methods. Hayes studied the two women for a long moment, recognizing the same stubborn integrity that had driven them to expose the original conspiracy. In that case, we need to develop a strategy that plays to your strengths while protecting you from their superior resources. As they began planning their defense against the Western Mineral Alliance, Rebecca thought about how completely her life had been shaped by the decision to answer Thomas Garrett's advertisement for a mail-order bride. That choice had led her from desperate poverty to incredible wealth, from powerless isolation to influential partnership, and now from comfortable success to a fight that would determine the future of justice in the American West. The Alliance had made a crucial miscalculation. They believed that threatening the people who'd exposed corruption would silence other potential witnesses. Instead, they were about to discover that some people become more dangerous when cornered, not less. The final battle for Thomas Garrett's legacy was about to begin, and this time the stakes included not just individual justice, but the survival of legal reform throughout the Western Territories. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Arizona mountains, and in the shadows of the canyon, new watchers took position to monitor the woman who had already proven she could bring down criminal empires. But Rebecca Matthews was no longer the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Copper Ridge. She was a woman who had learned that some fights are worth whatever they cost, and some principles are worth dying to defend. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, exactly as Detective Hayes had predicted it would. Not with guns or dynamite, but with documents that threatened to destroy everything Rebecca and Victoria had built. Sheriff Morrison burst into their morning strategy meeting with a handful of legal papers that would reshape the battlefield entirely. "Ladies, we've got multiple problems hitting simultaneously," Morrison announced, spreading the documents across Rebecca's desk. "Federal court injunction freezing all mining operations pending investigation of alleged fraud. Territorial warrant for your arrest on charges of document forgery and conspiracy to defraud territorial authorities. And a civil lawsuit from something called the Original Garrett Estate Trust, claiming Thomas never had legal authority to leave you his mining rights." Detective Hayes examined the papers with professional calm that didn't hide his concern. "This is exactly what I warned you about. The Alliance doesn't just kill their enemies anymore, they destroy them legally and financially first, making the eventual deaths look like suicides or accidents by desperate people who've lost everything." Rebecca felt the walls closing in as she read through the injunction. The legal language was complex, but the implications were clear. Someone had convinced a federal judge that their mining operation was based on fraudulent claims and criminal activity. Until the investigation was completed, they couldn't extract gold, pay workers, or access the funds that kept their community operating. Victoria studied the civil lawsuit more carefully. This Original Garrett Estate Trust claims to represent Thomas's legitimate heirs and says his letters to you were forgeries designed to steal valuable mining property. They're demanding immediate transfer of all assets and damages for 2 years of illegal extraction. "Who are these alleged legitimate heirs?" Rebecca asked. "Thomas told me he had only one sister, you." "According to this lawsuit, I'm not his real sister either," Victoria replied grimly. "They claim Thomas Garrett was an assumed identity, and the real Thomas Garrett died in California 3 years ago. They say the man you corresponded with was an imposter named Charles Morrison who stole the real Garrett's identity to claim his inheritance illegally." Sheriff Morrison looked up sharply. "Morrison, that's my surname. Is someone trying to implicate me in this fraud?" Hayes was already connecting the dots. "This is sophisticated character assassination. They're not just claiming the mining rights are invalid. They're arguing that Thomas Garrett never existed, which would make your marriage contract meaningless and your inheritance fraudulent. If they can prove their case, you'd lose everything and face federal prison for fraud conspiracy." The scope of the legal trap was breathtaking. The Alliance had crafted a narrative that turned their greatest strength, Thomas's meticulous documentation, into evidence of an elaborate criminal scheme. Every letter, every geological survey, every piece of evidence that had exposed the original conspiracy could now be reinterpreted as proof of a different fraud entirely. Martha Henderson arrived with more disturbing news. "Rebecca, Victoria, you need to know. 3 of our largest suppliers have cancelled their contracts, citing concerns about doing business with operations under federal investigation. And the bank in Phoenix is demanding immediate repayment of our expansion loans, claiming the fraud allegations violate the loan agreements." "How quickly is this happening?" Victoria asked. "All the cancellations and demands came within hours of each other. It's coordinated." Hayes nodded grimly. "Classic Alliance methodology. They've probably been preparing this legal assault for months, waiting for the right moment to execute it. By the time you realize what's happening, your business credit is destroyed, your assets are frozen, and your legal defense options are limited by lack of funds." But as they absorbed the magnitude of the attack, an unexpected ally arrived. Catherine Preston from the San Francisco Chronicle entered the office with a team of photographers and reporters, her expression mixing professional excitement with personal concern. "Miss Matthews, Miss Garrett, I've been investigating the legal actions against you, and I've discovered something extraordinary. The law firms filing these cases, the judges hearing them, and the witnesses providing testimony, they're all connected to a financial network that traces back to the same Eastern investment houses that funded the original territorial mining consortium. She spread her own documents across the desk, financial records, corporate filings, and correspondence that revealed the web of connections behind the legal assault. The original Garrett Estate Trust is financed by Whitmore and Associates, a New York investment firm that lost millions when the consortium was dissolved. The federal judge who issued the injunction, Harold Whitmore, is the firm's founder's brother. The territorial prosecutor demanding your arrest received a substantial campaign contribution from Whitmore Associates just last month. Hayes studied Preston's evidence with growing excitement. This is exactly what we need. If we can prove the legal actions are part of a criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate legal proceedings, we can turn their own weapons against them. Victoria was already thinking strategically. But we need to act fast. Every day, these injunctions remain in place. We lose workers, suppliers, and community support. If people believe we're criminals, everything we've built will collapse, even if we're eventually vindicated. There's something else, Preston continued. My investigation has uncovered evidence that the Alliance is planning similar legal attacks against mining operations in Colorado, Nevada, and California. You're not just fighting for your own business. You're the test case for a strategy they plan to use throughout the West. The revelation that their battle had national implications added both pressure and opportunity. If they could expose and defeat the Alliance's legal strategy, they would protect other communities from similar attacks. If they failed, the precedent would encourage the criminal organization to expand their sophisticated assault on legitimate mining operations everywhere. Rebecca looked around the room at the people who had become her allies in this fight. Victoria, whose initial hostility had transformed into loyal partnership. Sheriff Morrison, whose integrity had survived the corruption that claimed his predecessor. Detective Hayes, whose professional expertise provided hope against overwhelming odds. Catherine Preston, whose journalism had already changed American mining law. And Martha Henderson, whose simple decency represented the community they were all fighting to protect. We're not just defending ourselves, she realized aloud. We're defending the principle that criminals can't use legal manipulation to steal what they couldn't take through violence. If the Alliance succeeds here, they'll use these methods everywhere. Hayes was already developing a counter-strategy. We need to split our response into multiple fronts. Legal defense against the immediate charges, financial counterattack to expose the Alliance's funding sources, and public relations campaign to maintain community support while the legal battles proceed. I can handle the public relations aspect, Preston offered. My newspaper contacts throughout the country are eager for updates on this story. If we can present evidence that the legal actions are fraudulent, public pressure might influence the judicial proceedings. Victoria volunteered for the financial counterattack. Thomas's documentation includes records of Alliance financial networks that were never fully investigated during the congressional hearings. If we can trace their current funding sources and expose them publicly, we might be able to freeze their assets the way they've frozen ours. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. The territorial warrant for your arrest puts me in a difficult position. Legally, I'm supposed to take you into custody, but if I can prove the warrant was obtained through fraud or corruption, I can refuse to execute it pending federal review. That leaves me with the legal defense, Rebecca said, but I'll need lawyers who can't be bought or intimidated by the Alliance. Hayes smiled for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge. I think I can help with that. The Pinkerton Agency has been building a network of attorneys specializing in cases against organized criminal enterprises. They're expensive, but they're honest, and they're very good at what they do. As they divided responsibilities and began implementing their counter-strategy, Rebecca felt a familiar sense of determination building. The Alliance had made the same mistake as their predecessors. They'd underestimated the resolve of people fighting for their homes, their livelihoods, and their principles. But this fight would be different from the original battle against the Territorial Mining Consortium. The Alliance was more sophisticated, better funded, and had learned from the consortium's failures. The legal battlefield was more complex than the straightforward corruption they'd exposed before, and the stakes were higher than ever. Over the next several days, their counterattack began showing results. Preston's newspaper articles revealed the financial connections between the Alliance and the legal actions, generating public skepticism about the fraud charges. Victoria's investigation of Alliance funding sources uncovered evidence of securities fraud and illegal political contributions that attracted federal attention. Sheriff Morrison's refusal to execute what he termed a corrupted warrant sparked territorial political controversy that worked in their favor. Most importantly, Hayes's legal team began dismantling the Alliance's case piece by piece. The original Garrett Estate Trust claimed to represent heirs who couldn't be located or verified. The federal judge's obvious conflict of interest violated judicial ethics rules. The territorial prosecutor's evidence consisted mainly of testimony from witnesses with criminal records and financial connections to Alliance front organizations. But the Alliance wasn't passive in the face of their counterattack. As the legal case began favoring Rebecca and Victoria, the criminal organization escalated to more direct methods. The first attempt came disguised as an industrial accident. A mining equipment malfunction that could have killed a dozen workers was traced to deliberate sabotage. The second attempt targeted Victoria directly, a carriage accident that was prevented only by Sheriff Morrison's decision to provide security escorts for their travel. The message was clear. If legal manipulation failed to destroy them, the Alliance was prepared to return to the violence that had characterized their earlier operations. Detective Hayes gathered them for an emergency meeting after the second assassination attempt. The Alliance is desperate. Their legal strategy is failing, and they're reverting to crude violence. This makes them more dangerous in the short term, but also more vulnerable to exposure and prosecution. "How do we end this?" Rebecca asked. "We can't spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders for assassins while fighting legal battles in courtrooms across the country." Hayes pulled out a map showing Alliance operations throughout the West. "We go on the offensive. Instead of just defending ourselves, we attack their entire network simultaneously, hit their operations in Colorado, Nevada, and California while their attention is focused on Arizona. Force them to fight on multiple fronts while dealing with the legal exposure you've created here." Victoria studied the map. "That would require coordination with law enforcement and journalists across multiple states. It would be like launching our own version of the congressional investigation that destroyed the consortium." "Exactly. But this time we control the timing and strategy, instead of reacting to their attacks." As they planned their offensive against the Western Mineral Alliance, Rebecca reflected on how far she'd traveled from the desperate woman who'd answered Thomas Garrett's advertisement for a mail-order bride. That woman had been seeking only survival and security. Now she was planning a coordinated assault against a criminal organization that threatened justice throughout the American West. The final phase of the fight for Thomas's legacy was about to begin, and this time they wouldn't wait for the enemy to strike first. The coordinated offensive against the Western Mineral Alliance began at precisely noon on October 15, 1887, with simultaneous raids and arrests across 4 states. Rebecca stood in the Phoenix Federal Marshal's office, watching telegraph reports flow in from Colorado, Nevada, and California as law enforcement agencies executed warrants based on evidence she and her allies had painstakingly assembled over. The previous month, Detective Hayes coordinated the multi-state operation from a map-covered table, marking successful arrests and seized assets as the reports arrived. Denver office reports 12 arrests, including Alliance Regional Coordinator Marcus Steinberg. San Francisco has taken 18 suspects into custody, along with financial records from 3 investment firms. Carson City seized the Alliance's entire Nevada operation. Mines, equipment, and documentation. Catherine Preston worked alongside a team of telegraph operators, ensuring that newspapers across the country received coordinated releases about the Alliance's criminal network. The story is breaking simultaneously in major papers from New York to Los Angeles. By evening, every American will know that the Western Mineral Alliance was systematically murdering miners and stealing claims throughout the West. Victoria Garrett monitored the financial aspect of their assault, tracking frozen bank accounts and seized assets. Alliance front companies are collapsing as their funding sources are cut off. 3 major investment firms have suspended operations pending federal investigation. Their ability to wage legal warfare just evaporated, but the Alliance's response was swift and deadly. As their criminal empire crumbled under coordinated law enforcement pressure, the organization's leadership made a desperate decision that would force the final confrontation Rebecca had been dreading. Sheriff Morrison burst into the federal office with news that changed everything. They've taken hostages. Alliance operatives seized the Copper Ridge schoolhouse an hour ago. 23 children and 2 teachers are being held at gunpoint. Their demand is simple: complete withdrawal of all federal charges and safe passage. Out of the territory, or they start killing children. The room fell silent. All their legal victories and coordinated arrests meant nothing if the Alliance was willing to murder innocent children to escape justice. Hayes immediately began coordinating with federal agencies. How many hostage takers? Unknown. At least 6 men, possibly more. They've barricaded themselves inside the school and threatened to kill anyone who approaches. The building sits on open ground, no way to approach without being seen. Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. These children were hostages because of her fight against the Alliance. Every choice she'd made, from refusing Brenfield's original bribe to launching the coordinated offensive, had led to this moment where innocent lives hung in the balance. "There has to be something we can do," she said. Victoria was already thinking tactically. "The school is built on the hill above the old mine entrance, Thomas's original claim. If the Alliance operatives don't know about the mine tunnels, we might be able to approach from below ground." Hayes studied architectural drawings of the school that Morrison had retrieved from the town records. The basement connects to the old root cellar system that predates the town's expansion. If those cellars connect to the mine tunnels, they do, Rebecca confirmed. Thomas mapped the entire underground system when he was planning his mining operation. There are passages that run beneath most of the original town buildings. The plan that emerged was dangerous but feasible. A small team would use the mine tunnels to approach the school from below, while federal marshals maintained visible positions around the building to hold the hostage-takers' attention. The basement approach would allow them to surprise the Alliance operatives and potentially rescue the hostages before they could be harmed. But the mission required someone who knew the tunnel system intimately, someone who had studied Thomas's maps and understood the underground layout of Copper Ridge. "I have to go," Rebecca said quietly. Hayes shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. This is a job for trained federal agents, not civilian witnesses." "Your federal agents don't know the mine system." "I do. I've spent 2 years studying Thomas's. in geological surveys and tunnel maps. Without me, you'll get lost underground while children die above ground. Victoria stepped forward. If Rebecca goes, I go too. This is our town, our responsibility and our fight. Ladies, this isn't about courage or responsibility, Hayes argued. It's about tactical expertise and combat experience. Neither of you has training for hostage rescue operations. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. Detective Hayes, with respect, this community has survived and thrived because these women were willing to do things trained professionals said were impossible. Maybe it's time to trust their judgment again. The debate was interrupted by another telegram from the school. The Alliance operatives were growing impatient and had set a deadline: complete federal withdrawal within 2 hours, or they would begin executing hostages one by one. Faced with an impossible timeline and limited options, Hayes reluctantly agreed to include Rebecca and Victoria in the rescue team. But he insisted on leading the operation himself, accompanied by 2 federal agents with combat experience. As they prepared for the underground approach, Rebecca found herself thinking about Thomas Garrett and the legacy that had brought them. To this point, he had died trying to expose criminal corruption, and now the final battle to destroy that corruption would take place in tunnels he had carved from Arizona rock. The descent into the mine system was treacherous in darkness, with only lanterns to guide them through passages that hadn't been maintained since Thomas's death. But Rebecca's knowledge of his maps proved invaluable, leading them through a maze of branching tunnels toward the basement beneath the school. As they moved through the underground passages, Hayes quietly briefed them on what they might encounter. Alliance operatives are desperate and heavily armed. They know capture means federal prison or execution, so they have nothing to lose. Expect them to fight to the death rather than surrender. The tunnel system brought them to a natural cave that connected to the school's foundation. Through gaps in the stone walls, they could hear voices above, both the harsh commands of the hostage-takers and the frightened whimpering of children. Victoria pointed to a section of the basement wall where Thomas's mining had created a concealed entrance. That passage leads directly under the school's main floor. If we can get through quietly, we'll be behind their defensive positions. The breach into the school basement required careful work to avoid alerting the Alliance operatives above. Hayes and his agents used mining tools to widen the passage enough for the team to enter single file, while Rebecca and Victoria monitored for sounds that might indicate discovery. Once inside the school basement, they could clearly hear the situation. Above, 6 Alliance operatives held the children in the main classroom, while 2 more guarded the entrances. The hostage-takers were growing increasingly agitated as their deadline approached with no sign of federal withdrawal. Hayes divided the team for simultaneous assault on multiple positions. His federal agents would take the 2 guards at the entrances, while he, Rebecca, and Victoria approached the main classroom from the basement stairs. "Remember," Hayes whispered, "the children's safety is the only priority. Don't take any risks that might endanger them." But as they prepared to ascend to the main floor, they heard something that changed the entire dynamic: the voice of Alliance leader Edmund Carstairs, the man who had orchestrated the legal assault on their mining operation. Carstairs was speaking to someone outside the school, apparently negotiating surrender terms, but his words revealed the true scope of the Alliance's desperation. Federal withdrawal isn't enough anymore. We need Matthews and Garrett eliminated permanently, along with all evidence they've gathered. This operation was supposed to be surgical removal of 2 problem individuals, not warfare against the entire federal government. The Alliance leadership had never intended to honor any surrender agreement. They planned to kill the hostages, eliminate Rebecca and Victoria, and disappear into the Western Territories where federal authority was still limited. Hayes made a quick tactical decision. Instead of waiting for coordinated assault, he signaled immediate action. The element of surprise was their only advantage against desperate criminals who had already decided to commit mass murder. The rescue operation unfolded with deadly precision. Hayes's federal agents eliminated the entrance guards silently, while the main team burst into the classroom, where Carstairs and his men held the children. But Carstairs was faster than expected. As federal agents stormed the room, he grabbed the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 8 years old, and held a gun to her head while backing toward the window. "Nobody moves, or this child dies," he snarled. "Matthews, Garrett, I know you're here. This entire disaster started with your interference in legitimate business operations." Rebecca stepped into the open, knowing that Carstairs needed to see his primary target. "Let the children go. Your fight is with me, not with them." "My fight is with everyone who thinks they can destroy years of careful planning and profitable operations," Carstairs replied. "The Alliance has invested millions in Western mining development, created thousands of jobs, and brought prosperity to remote territories. You've destroyed all of that to satisfy your naive notions about justice." Victoria moved to flank Carstairs' position while he focused on Rebecca. "You call murder and theft legitimate business operations. You call corrupting judges and bribing officials profitable development. I call it necessary efficiency in a lawless region where federal authority is weak and local officials are incompetent," Carstairs shot back. "Without the Alliance's coordination, Western mining would still be chaotic individual operations that benefit no one." But while he justified his criminal empire, Carstairs failed to notice that his hostage, the 8-year-old girl, was carefully working to loosen his grip on her arm. The child had been listening to adult conversations about the Alliance for weeks, and she understood that the man holding her was responsible for threatening her community. At the crucial moment, the girl bit Carstairs' wrist and broke free from his grasp. Hayes's shot took the Alliance leader center mass before he could recover his aim, ending the hostage crisis and the criminal organization's last desperate gambit. As federal agents secured the school and ensured the children's safety, Rebecca found herself sitting on the school steps, overwhelmed by the finality of what had just occurred. The Western Mineral Alliance was destroyed, its leadership dead or imprisoned, and its criminal network dismantled across 4 states. Catherine Preston arrived to document the conclusion of what she would later describe as the most significant victory against organized crime in American Western history. Her photographs would show Rebecca and Victoria surrounded by the children they had helped rescue, symbols of the community they had fought to protect. Detective Hayes coordinated the final arrests and evidence collection that would ensure the Alliance's surviving members faced federal prosecution. The criminal organization that had murdered dozens of miners and stolen millions in mineral wealth was finally held accountable for their crimes. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful moment came when she returned to Thomas Garrett's grave in the Copper Ridge Cemetery. The simple wooden marker had been replaced with a proper headstone, paid for by the community he had died trying to protect. Standing beside his grave, she spoke the words she had never been able to say. "Thomas, your fight for justice is finally finished. The criminals who killed you are gone. The community you cared about is safe, and the legal reforms you started will protect other mining communities throughout the West. You chose well when you trusted a mail-order bride with your legacy." Victoria joined her at the graveside, and together they watched the sun set over the thriving town that had grown from Thomas's sacrifice and their determination to honor it. 5 years later, Rebecca Matthews Garrett, she had legally taken Thomas's surname to honor their intended marriage, stood before the United States Congress once again, this time to receive a special commendation for her role in exposing and defeating organized crime in the American West. The woman who had stepped off, A train in Copper Ridge, seeking only survival, had become a symbol of individual courage, confronting institutional corruption. Her story had inspired federal legislation, reformed territorial law enforcement, and demonstrated that justice was possible even against overwhelming odds. The mail-order bride advertisement that had brought her to Arizona territory had promised a partnership with a lonely prospector. Instead, it had led to a partnership with destiny itself, a fight for justice that reshaped the American West and proved that sometimes the most ordinary people are called to do the most extraordinary things. Thomas Garrett's gold mine still produced wealth that supported the thriving community of New Copper Ridge. But his greatest treasure had been the woman he never met, who carried his torch for justice long after his death and ensured that his sacrifice illuminated the path to a better world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.